Hi, it's a new day. So we'll move on to the 1851 Indian Appropriations Act, which was essentially the foundation or like the groundwork for the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which kind of established specific reservations for each tribe. But this treaty is the foundation for the reservation policy, which again was seen as the best way for assimilation and was seen as a sort of benevolent policy to the white Americans as a way to protect Native Americans from the encroachment of white settlers. But that is essentially bullshit, and it's just a way to get rid of Native Americans because the white Americans thought they were better than them and they wanted the land for economic prospects and money because American greed. So the Indians wouldn't be allowed to leave the reservation without like specific permission. So basically they can't, which proves a problem because there's not a lot of game inside the reservations like to get food, and although they're allowed like rations from the federal government, they turn out to be rubbish, and with the Civil War they kind of stop supplying them. So yeah, in reality, like I've said, the US saw Native Americans as a threat to their expansionist economic goals. So the reservation policy was a way to basically shove them further west in allotted plots of land, and then the white Americans could also move west but use it for their economic goals. But when the reservation land, as we'll see, turned out to be prosperous for economic prospects, white Americans will want to take them off the reservations which they put them on in these treaties and guarantee to them forever. Moving on swiftly to the 1860s, so just a quick one. 1861, the Treaty of Fort Wide, which was with the Cheney and the Arapaho, that might not be said right, I'll put the spelling, and this was an agreement for them to move further west. This was their reservation policy, and it resulted in the Sand Creek Massacre, which we talked about in that previous clip or video, I'm not sure yet. We'll find out. So another few small ones in 1860s. In 1867 there was the Treaty of Fort Wide, which was again with the Cheney and the Arapaho, and was like the following reservation after the Sand Creek Massacre. So after that they were kind of punished and taken off the land given in the Treaty of Fort Wide, and they were pushed further west to western Oklahoma, and it's going to be a not as good quality reservation, it'll be smaller, etc., because it is a punishment essentially. And then 1868, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, but the second, a different Treaty of Fort Laramie, not very connected to the first one, which established the Great Sioux Reservation on the Black Hills of Dakota, which we see being problematic with Custer's Last Stand, Battle of Buckhorn, Great Sioux War, all that fun stuff in the 1870s. So again, that's an example of where tribes are given reservation lands. It's another example of where tribes were given reservation lands, and then the white Americans afterwards were like, oh, that land has gold / economic possibilities, we want that land. And then violence, and then they take the land, and then they blame the Native Americans for causing problems, even though the white Americans caused the problem. A bit of a shift in narrative now. We have the report on the condition of the Indian tribes in 1867, and this was written by the Indian Peace Commission, and it was set up by Congress to try and find a means to the end of all the fighting and all the violence with the Native Americans, like throughout the 1860s and like the Great Plains and stuff. And ultimately this report looked at the observed some of the violence, looked at Native Americans' life on the settlements and the clashes between settlers, and concluded that it was the white Americans' fault, shock horror, and said that it was their fault for causing this conflict, and a lot of it would have been preventable. And so as a result of this, Congress endorsed a plan to concentrate all the Plains Indians into 2 large reservations further west to try and permanently cease any violence and conflict between them and the white Americans by just moving them further west on 2 big reservation lands to stop disputes and stuff. But so this report was then followed up by Grant's peace policy, that it was known as. So President Grant's attempt at doing Native American policy, but in a way that was more benevolent. So he favoured the reservation policy, but in a way that was kind of in the sense that it should be putting Native Americans on reservations, but it's their own kind of land to do what they will. get supplies from the government and will like permanently not be meddled with by white Americans, which doesn't happen, but I mean, the thought was there, I guess. I don't know. So he established things like a new board of Indian commissioners. He also attempted to remove any corruption within like the ministers working for the Native Americans, but this ultimately failed as they were greedy and corrupt still, and the funds that they were granted to give to the reservations and intended for aid for Native Americans was systematically stolen, in essence. So Grant's peace policy, the thought was there, but not so peaceful, really. In conclusion, Grant's peace policy was marked with the Indian Appropriations Act 1871. So again, the Indian Appropriations Act Part 2, following up to the 1851 one. But this one was where Indians were moved from an independent nation, so like being essentially free to live their own lifestyle on the reservations, to being wards of the state. So it was like wards being kind of like property of the state, like children of the state. And so the policy in its aims were to Americanise Native Americans by concentrating them. Sorry, a man running fast. Aims to concentrate them on reservations so they could ultimately destroy their way of life, and any sort of culture, norms, values within their lifestyle could be squashed with them being in one tight space and it being criminalised for them to live out practices of their culture. So things like herbal remedies and tribal laws and the powers of the tribal chief, they were all abolished and made illegal. So the aim is to force Native Americans to Americanise by making them conform to the ideals and the culture of the white Americans. So in this sense, Congress could now change reservations without consulting Native Americans before. I think they have to have 3/4 approval from the male Native Americans, something like that. But now they can just do what they want, essentially. So again, Grant's peace policy, not so peaceful and not so benevolent and oppressive. In conclusion, again. The last major act we'll be talking about is the Dawes Act in 1887, and this was one of the strongest acts in terms of what it did for Native Americans and how it destroyed their lives. Like if you're doing a comparison question of like, what was the most important for destroying Native American culture? I mean, this is always your top one, do you know what I mean? So this is essentially the allotment policy, and so it broke up the reservations which had been established for like the past tens and tens of years. At this point, it broke them up to 160 acres per Native American family, and then 80 for single males. So now instead of having all tribes in one reservation, where a lot of the culture is destroyed, so they can't like go hunting the buffalo and all that stuff, they still could live out some Native American like values, like even things like the tribal chief, even if they were abolished, I'm sure they could have found ways to keep their culture alive, but by completely ripping apart the reservations and putting them on allotments, there's really no way Native American culture can survive in any essence or form that it did prior. So they were expected to be self-sufficient landowners, so expected to Americanise and conform into like Western white American society by capitalism. They will be granted 25 years citizenship if they obliged with these new rules and if they became successful landowners. But ultimately, all this undermined their values about not being able to own the land, and also just the fact that Native Americans didn't have any farming experience, so a lot of them couldn't become successful farmers because they had no means of the knowledge of how to do that. And also, if they sold the land they were given for money, a lot of them didn't know how to handle money, and so eventually would fall into poverty and become destitute. You can now just